In 2021, a single rib with spikes fused directly onto the bone left scientists scratching their heads. It was something no one had seen in any dinosaur before. Now, in 2025, it's finally known what that rib belonged to. An animal covered in bizarre armor, wielding a possible proto-tail club, and redefining what experts thought they knew about early ankylosaurs. The mystery rib was just the beginning. The real creature was stranger and spikier than anyone imagined. So, what did this Jurassic tank actually look like, and why does it matter? Let's pull the curtain back on Spicomellus. Natural History Museum of London paleontologist Dr. Susanna Maidment and a huge team of colleagues published a paper in the journal Nature, Ecology and Evolution in 2021 on a single ultra-bizarre, never-before-seen dinosaur rib purchased from a commercial fossil dealer in Cambridge in 2019. Oh, it's just a rib, many might think. Sure, a rib with 4 spikes sticking out of it, but, just a rib. That description alone sounds strange enough to paleo enthusiasts, but the real mindbender was that the spikes weren't simply attached by soft tissue or ligaments the way many reptiles and mammals carry armor. They were actually fused into the bone itself, locked together as one continuous structure. To most paleontologists, this seemed anatomically nonsensical. A rib is supposed to protect the chest cavity and to move as the animal moves or breathes. How could bony spikes stick out of those ribs and allow the animal to move? It immediately raised questions. Was this fossil real, or was it cobbled together from unrelated pieces, like a paleontological Frankenstein's monster? If it was real, was it some kind of diseased or mutated individual, or was it something totally new? Those doubts weren't casual. Museums and researchers have been burned before by clever forgeries, especially with high-value fossils. Susanna and her team went straight to work with histologic analysis, cutting a slice of the bone, grinding it down to transparency, mounting on a glass microscope slide, and examining the tissues under said scope. If the spikes had been attached artificially, the joint would have looked different inside, like 2 separate pieces glued together. Instead, the microscope showed the tissues had grown together naturally, with bone fibers interlocking just the way they should. This was not a fake. It wasn't even a pathology. It was genuine anatomy, just an anatomy without a frame of reference. This obviously made the discovery even weirder, as almost nothing in the history of tetrapod life looked like this. The closest examples aren't even dinosaurs at all. There's Protuberum, a mid-Triassic Brazilian cynodont that carried nodules directly knitted into its ribs. Achitostropheus, a late Triassic Arizonan long-necked archosaur related to the famous Tanystropheus, whose vertebrae sported recurved bony spines. And Euskolasuchus, a late Triassic Atosauriform from Virginia, which had osteoderms fused to some of its ribs. None of these exactly matched what this rib preserved, but they are the only vaguely comparable features scientists can point to. Imagine walking across a dig site and pulling out a rib that looks like somebody hammered nails through it at an angle, each one sticking out like the posts of a vicious fence. That's the type of new we're working with here. Susanna's research team had to make a call. They compared microscopic structure, the overall shape of the spikes, phylogenetic analyses, and the way the rib was built, and concluded it belonged to the Ankylosauria, or armored dinosaurs. That assignment may sound bold, but ankylosaurs are known for integrating their armor right into their skeletons with bony plates called osteoderms. The weird part here was that every known ankylosaur had an exoskeleton. The armor did not integrate directly into the skeleton, but sat within the skin over top of the skeleton. With that, the fossil finally got a name: Spicomellus afer, the African caller of spikes. The rock it came out of, the Elmer's 3 Formation, dated back to the Middle Jurassic, which is much older than the late Cretaceous ankylosaurs most people think of, the tank-like beasts with tail clubs. That meant this lone rib was the oldest ankylosaur ever confirmed, pushing the group's fossil record back tens of millions of years. The rib preserved enough anatomical information to establish the ankylosaurian lineage had already diverged from its stegosaurian cousins by the Bathonian stage, the middle of the mid-Jurassic epoch, but there was zero information about the rest of the skeleton. No skull, no limbs, not even a hint of what the tail might have looked like. So the rib kept its secrets, and for 4 years the mystery remained unsolved. Was this animal bristling with spikes everywhere, or was the rib an isolated oddity? Was it a medium-sized herbivore hiding among the ferns, or a heavily armored roadblock lumbering across dinosaur highways? The rib alone couldn't answer that. But then, in 2025, a far more complete skeleton was described in the journal Nature by Maidment and her colleagues, and it shows the animal to be even more unlike anything anyone has ever seen before. Except for maybe on the big screen. Prior to the new publication, individual fossils that resembled the ribs and spikes of Spicomellus were being put up for sale online. Morocco has relatively lax fossil laws, similar to the US, so you can kinda just sell whatever. These online listings told Maidment and her team that there were far more Spicomellus fossils out there than just a rib, and several expeditions later, they found just what they were looking for. Between 2019 and 2021, Maidment and company were able to find the type locality from which the rib had been found, thanks to discussions with the guy who sold it. In 2023, the scientists went back to this locality to search for more fossils of the animal. Out of the quarry dug into the middle mid-Jurassic aged Elmer's 3 Formation south of Boulemane in the Middle Atlas Mountains of Morocco, the team found a partial skeleton of the animal. Though still fragmentary, the new specimen completes the picture enough to tell roughly what the animal may have looked like, how it may have functioned, and it sort of flips ankylosaur evolution on its head. The spiked rib wasn't just a one-off. That kind of defense was everywhere on the body, built into nearly every part of the skeleton. Instead of one strange rib, here was an entire dinosaur that looked like it had been weaponized from head to tail. A true fortress. The mighty ankylosaurian ankylosaurs of the late Cretaceous, like Ankylosaurus and Euoplocephalus, along with their clubs and nodular bony armor, carried half-rings or collars on their necks. These collars were made up of sheets of bone fused together with individual lumps of osteoderms to protect the neck from injuries from above. Some didn't have a sheet of bone to form a collar and instead just had a collar of loose osteoderm lumps. Spicomellus took this to an extreme, well before these later examples. Spicomellus had multiple collars that were extensive enough to call them horseshoes. 5 osteoderm spikes jutted out around each collar, 1 in the middle and 4 to the sides. 2 of those spikes weren't small either, they measured almost a full meter in length. That means the animal's throat was framed by spears aimed in every direction. Any predator going for the neck would risk impaling itself on a row of blades well before it got anywhere near the supple neck giblets. Behind the collars, the body armor didn't calm down either. Covering the ribs sat more fusions of bony spines and plates, fitted together almost like shingles on a roof. There seemed to be some that sprouted out of the base of the neck and beginning of the shoulder area. There were large, flat, triangular forms that likely lined the side of the animal from the base of the head to the space in front of the hind leg. The hips had a large shield of fused pieces sitting over them. If you've seen these sheets of bone, called sacral shields, on nodosaurs and some ankylosaurs before, you know they look like a mosaic of tiles pressed flat. On Spicomellus, that shield tied directly into the rib spikes. It gave the impression of a single continuous carapace, with eruption of spikes poking out like jagged nails sticking through wood. Some sheets of curved bone have spikes sticking out of them, and those may have placed over the hips to protect the rear, while others were possibly at the base of the tail. What really made this unique is how inconsistent it all was. Later ankylosaurs, especially the Cretaceous heavyweights, tend to fall into a more orderly system. The armor follows rows, the spikes get standardized, and the overall shape looks symmetrical, even if still formidable. Spicomellus ignored that neatness. It looked haphazard, like its armor was still in an experimental phase. Some parts looked like they were optimized purely for deterrence. some for elaborate visual display, and others for structural strength. That's what makes it so important. It captures ankylosaur armor development far earlier than expected, and does it with a bizarre level of complexity. So, what you're seeing in this new skeleton isn't just another armored dinosaur. It's one that combined every possible strategy at once. Short spikes on the ribs, sheets of armor on the hips, and a throat ring armed with longinus lances. No other known dinosaur, armored or otherwise, displays this melting pot of defenses, all in a single body plan. If ankylosaurs of the Cretaceous look like orderly tanks, then Spicomellus looks more like an improvised fortress bristling with homemade weapons. A zombie apocalypse battle van, if you will. And because it comes from the Middle Jurassic, it suggests ankylosaurs may have been far more inventive in their origins than assumed from their later, more standardized relatives. Try to put yourself in the place of a theropod predator in North Africa 168 million years ago. You spot a medium-sized herbivore, and you think, easy meal. You close in, but then it turns, and instead of a flank or throat, you see spikes and blades in every direction. It's not just armor for taking a hit, it's the kind of structure that makes you hesitate before even trying. That's why researchers have leaned on the idea that this might be the most metal dinosaur found so far. Every angle of its body put out a clear signal, bite at your own risk. But the spines and shields weren't the only feature catching attention. The bones of the tail are quite bizarre for the time and place of Spicomellus. The details might push back one of the hallmark weapons of ankylosaurs by more than 100 million years. Tail clubs are one of those features that everyone associates with the big late Cretaceous ankylosaurs, the ones roaming alongside Triceratops and Tyrannosaurs. In fact, paleontologists have usually treated them as a late-appearing adaptation, something that only evolved when the group had many tens of millions of years under their belt. That's why the new Spicomellus skeleton has hit such a nerve. When scientists analyzed the few tail vertebrae, they saw something they simply did not expect. The vertebrae near the base weren't typical flexible joints. Instead, they were extended and reinforced into what researchers call handle vertebrae, the critical structural base of a tail club. This isn't a full, knob-ended club like you'd expect to see in Ankylosaurus itself. Most of the tail, including the end, is missing in Spicomellus, but the resemblance is close enough to suggest the starting blueprint was already present in the Middle Jurassic. But in ordinary terms, the base of the tail was rigid. Instead of moving with lots of wiggle, the vertebrae locked together into a section that could swing more like a baseball bat handle. That makes a difference, because when that stiff zone whips the rest of the tail, it multiplies the force at the far end. Even without a solid weight on the tip, a tail structured like this becomes a potential weapon. Here, Spicomellus had a version that was biologically engineered for leverage. The stiff handle absorbed the strain and gave the rest of the tail the mechanics of a club, long before the dinosaur dynasty's traditional tail clubs ever show up in the record. And if we follow the timeline, the implications are wild. Until now, most studies placed the evolution of tail clubs around 80 to 70 million years ago, near the very end of the Mesozoic. Spicomellus lived around 168 million years ago. That's a gap of close to 100 million years. In other words, the foundations of tail club anatomy might be nearly twice as old as anyone expected. What once looked like a quirky late invention of one branch might instead have been an ancient prototype, present at the start and then elaborated on later in the lineage. Suddenly, these animals are not just armor with legs, they were experimenting with mechanical defense systems right from the beginning. Though no tail weapon is yet known in Spicomellus, the research team speculated a unique thagomizer-like club of spikes at the end, rather than a club, a true stegosaurian thagomizer, or even the Aztec battle axe seen in something weird like Stegoros. Now combine the tail structure with the extravagant armor described earlier. Ribs fused with spikes, giant lance-like spikes sticking out of the butt and tail, a sacral shield, and an armored collar. On the rear, a tail beginning to act like a swingable club. Together, it paints a picture of a dinosaur practically engineered to resist attack from every angle. Go for the neck and you face a barricade of spikes. Come from behind and you risk getting smacked with a bone-reinforced tail. Even if the early tail wasn't smashing bone the way a later ankylosaur club could, it would still be enough to sting, spear, bruise, or at the very least, startle anything trying to grab hold. That does raise a bigger question. What was the weapon for? Defensive use seems obvious. Predator pressure in the Middle Jurassic was intense, with large allosaurs, ceratosaurs, and megalosaurs prowling the ecosystems of North Africa. But it's also possible the armor had more social roles. Later ankylosaurs used their clubs against each other as well as against predators, bashing flank armor in contests over mates or territory. Direct evidence of these physical social interactions can be found in the damaged armor of Zool. If Spicomellus already had the stiffened tail foundation, maybe it was already experimenting with that same behavior. In that case, we're not just seeing defensive structures, but also hints of ritualized combat within the lineage, which would make it one of the earliest dinosaurs showing that kind of weapon evolution. This could also help to explain the extreme visual component to the armor of Spicomellus, since no other ankylosaurs are known to have this level of tall, thin spines. Might the elaborate, long, thin spines of Spicomellus evolved first as a visual display to predators and members of its own species before refining into more practical armor in later ankylosaurs? The real takeaway here is simple. The origin of ankylosaur tail clubs has to be pushed back far earlier than previously thought. Instead of being bizarre outliers of the Cretaceous, they might represent a core ancestral trait. Spicomellus forces scientists to overhaul the timeline for how and when these bone-breaking defenses appeared. It suggests ankylosaurs exploded with new adaptations early on, throwing armor and weaponry on every part of their bodies long before many other dinosaurs had innovated anything equivalent. If these strategies were already up and running in the Bethonian stage of the mid-Jurassic, then ankylosaurs must have been carving out very specific roles in their ecosystems right from the start. What sort of world were these armored pioneers living in? This is what the Elmer's 3 formation most likely looked like during the time of Spicomellus. Instead of desert, which is what a lot of people think of when they hear Morocco, this was a patchwork of lush river plains and seasonal floodplains, with vegetation growing along waterways and ferns stretching across the damp, low ground. The rivers would have cut through the land, creating channels where plant material gathered, and in between those were open spaces trodden flat by the movements of sauropods. The rock record depicts intermittent invasion of the land by the sea, with somewhat coastal environments like what you might see along the coast of Coorong, South Australia today. The air was warm, the ecosystem diverse, and the animals enormous. It wasn't empty rolling savanna, it was a landscape lush with food for hungry herbivores and the carnivores willing to test their teeth against them. Among Spicomellus' neighbors were true giants. An indeterminate sauropod, originally and dubiously identified as a possible species of Cetiosaurus, is known to have wandered here, as well as possibly the quite valid Atlasaurus, a towering North African sauropod known for its ridiculous proportions. Imagine elephant herds, but swap the elephants for animals with necks stretching several meters above tree lines, moving in groups, stripping foliage wherever they went. That was the dominant force in the ecosystem. Beneath those long necks waddled an entirely different class of armored herbivores. Adracticlet, for example, is one of the first stegosaurs documented from Africa, and it lived alongside Spicomellus. It carried tall, thin plates that transitioned into spines along the tail. Check out my video on the animal when you get the chance. Another contemporary was the equally bizarre Thyreosaurus. This stegosaur seemed to have ankylosaur-like armor laid down on its back that transitioned into the traditional spikes along the tail. This one is mysterious in a similar way to Spicomellus, so hopefully someday a better specimen is found to help explain the enigmatic armor. I also have a video about this freak around here somewhere, so you can get your fill of Elmer's 3 dinos. The presence of 3 bizarre armored dinosaurs means this part of mid-Jurassic Morocco had 3 quite different approaches to body armor evolving at once. The Stegosaur plan, with vertical plates along the backbone and tail spikes, and the Ankylosaur plan, with flattened osteoderms and spikes fused right into the skeleton. And, maybe a third form that rode the line between the two. Spicomellus itself wasn't the biggest animal on the floodplain. why don't we bring in Mr. Man from Animal Planet's
The Most Extreme
to show you just how mid-sized it was. According to Silverhawk, a frequent prehistoric animal size estimator, Spicomellus may have grown to around 6 meters, or 19.85 feet in length. Though this estimation was made when only a rib was known, so it was based on math plus the known proportions of other ankylosaurs and may no longer be accurate. Judging from the new skeleton, it seems to land in a medium-sized class by ankylosaur standards, bulkier than some of the smaller ones but nowhere near as massive as later tank-like relatives of the Cretaceous. Still, it had more than enough mass to justify carrying the ridiculous set of spikes and shields scattered across its frame. You don't haul that much bone armor around unless you need it. Thanks, Mr. Man. So, what was it eating? Almost certainly low-browsing plants, ferns, cycads, and ground-level vegetation. Living alongside stegosaurs means it had stiff competition for greenery. The difference is that stegosaurs likely went after slightly taller food sources since they had longer necks and taller legs. Spicomellus probably worked to the ground cover, scraping leaves and stems nobody else cared much for. That allowed it to occupy a niche without bumping into the same food markets as sauropods, ornithopods, or stegosaurs. The fossil record for Moroccan theropods in this slice of time isn't perfect, but tracks and fragmentary bones point to the presence of mid to very large carnivores. Some footprints indicate predators approaching Tyrannosaurus in size. These predators would see a mid-sized ankylosaur as potential prey, but one glance at Spicomellus's weaponry suggests it wasn't an easy target. The brutal spikes along the ribs and shoulders were an obvious deterrent, like a gigantic porcupine. On top of that, histological analysis of the spikes revealed something more than mere decoration. The bone tissues showed complex layering of fibers, arranged in a way that suggests reinforcement against strain and impact. That means the spikes weren't fragile. They were adapted to absorb shocks from biting or striking, making them more reliable in repeated confrontations. This combination, medium size, specialized diet, and specialized defense, suggests Spicomellus filled its own niche, one where survival didn't depend on running fast or hiding well. Instead, it prospered by turning itself into a hazard to anything looking for an easy kill. It might not have been the biggest animal in Jurassic Morocco, but it may have been one of the hardest to handle. Spicomellus isn't just another spiky dinosaur, it's also a marker that tells us how early armored strategies emerged in Gondwana, the southern continental landmass of the Jurassic. That is where the real twist comes in, because its armor isn't just a curiosity, it forces a rethinking of how ankylosaurs appeared and spread across the world map much earlier than expected. Spicomellus shows that ankylosaurs didn't wait until the Cretaceous to start tinkering with extreme defense. By the Middle Jurassic, they were already throwing out prototypes, spikes fused to ribs, layered shields, even a starter kit for a tail club. That means armor didn't creep along slowly in evolution. It appeared fast and with more variety than paleontologists used to imagine. And that's just one skeleton. The first rib hinted at something strange. The second specimen rewrote early ankylosaur history. So what else is hiding in Gondwana's rocks? Follow along, because the next fossil might upend an even bigger piece of dinosaur history.
You're still here. It's over. Go home.
Oh, well, I did forget one thing. Now that there's a better specimen of this dinosaur and the research team could definitively confirm the original holotype rib belongs to the same animal as the more complete specimen, they had a much larger list of anatomical data to work with. That means they could perform a much better phylogenetic analysis on Spicomellus. Once they turned the new anatomical information into data and pitted that data against the data of other known ankylosaurs, stegosaurs, and early ornithischians, they found that Spicomellus came out as most closely related to the early Cretaceous Chinese Zhuangqilong and early Cretaceous Mongolian Chamosaurus as part of a polytomy, or a group with members who are related to one another, but just how related is unknown, or that they are equally likely to be related. This group is now found to be an exceedingly early diverging group of ankylosaurs right outside of the Ankylosauridae proper. Very unusually, the 2025 paper with new Spicomellus material found the most unusual ankylosaurs to be in completely different places than what had been found in previous studies. Previously, studies have found that the ankylosauria was split into two groups, the parankylosaurs and the euankylosaurs. The euankylosaurs are all the ankylosaurs known from the northern hemisphere, and the parankylosaurs are all known from the southern hemisphere. The parankylosaurs included the bizarre Australian Conmarosaurus, Antarctic Antarctopelta, and the Chilean Stegoros. The new study did not find the secondary group of ankylosaurs, and instead placed Stegoros as the earliest diverging member of Ankylosauria, Conmarosaurus as the earliest nodosaurid, and Antarctopelta as a polycanthine. This is super bizarre and shakes up the evolutionary tree of ankylosaurs way more than the early appearance of complex armor in Spicomellus. What this means, how valid it is, how much of a consensus it will see, all remain up in the air at this time. Only more remains of different early ankylosaurs and stegosaurs will help get to the bottom of this and help organize this tree. For more interesting stories about nature, the history of life, or what goes bump in the night, subscribe, like this video, drop a comment in the comment section below, and hit the bell icon to stay in the know with everything Edge. Thanks for watching.